Colton Hayes was a man of the Wild West, a place where the dust never seemed to settle and the loneliness never seemed to end. His ranch was tucked away in the farthest corner of the land, far from the nearest town, where the hills and plains stretched endlessly like an ocean of nothing. The wind howled like a wild animal, and the sun burned down harshly from a sky that seemed to be as empty as the land below it. Colton had always been a solitary man, and in the years since his family had passed away, the ranch had become his only companion. The work was grueling, but it was what kept him going. Day after day, he tended to the animals, fixed broken fences, and made sure the crops were alive, all the while feeling the weight of the world pressing down on him. Colton had known sorrow. He had buried his parents and his younger brother under the dry earth years ago. The ranch had been their dream, a place to build a future, but after their untimely deaths, the dream had turned into a burden. Colton had no interest in love or companionship anymore. The land was all he needed, and the solitude was something he had grown used to, even preferred. There was no need for other people when the world felt so indifferent. His heart had closed itself off long ago, and the years that followed had only cemented that isolation. But one evening, just as the sun began to set and the world was painted in hues of orange and purple, Colton noticed something strange. From the edge of his property, he saw a figure approaching, a woman walking with unsteady steps through the dry grass and dirt. She was a young woman, maybe in her 20s, with long, wild hair and clothes that looked as though they had seen better days. She was stumbling as if she had been walking for hours, and her face was smeared with dust, sweat, and what looked like tears. Colton was immediately suspicious. It wasn't often that anyone ventured this far out into the wilderness, especially someone who seemed to be in such distress. At first, he thought about ignoring her, pretending he hadn't seen her. It wasn't his problem after all. But something in her eyes caught his attention, a desperate, almost pleading look that made him hesitate. He couldn't just leave her out there in the wild. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that it wasn't his concern, Colton knew he couldn't turn away from someone in need. As the woman drew closer, Colton noticed the way she held herself. She was trying to remain strong, but it was clear she was exhausted. She was breathing heavily, and her face showed signs of fear. When she finally reached the porch of his cabin, she stopped and looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need shelter, just for the night." Colton studied her for a moment, still unsure of whether or not to trust her, but there was something about her that seemed genuine, something that made him want to help. Maybe it was the fact that she was all alone in this barren land, or maybe it was the way she looked at him, like she had no one else to turn to. "Who are you?" Colton asked, his voice rough like a man who hadn't spoken to anyone in a long time. He crossed his arms over his chest, standing tall and wary, waiting for her answer. The woman paused for a moment as if deciding how much to reveal. "My name is Sarah McAllister," she said. I was traveling with my uncle, but he's gone now. I've been on my own for a while." Colton's suspicion deepened. There was something about her story that didn't quite add up. But he decided to let her explain further. "My uncle. He died a few days ago." Sarah continued, her voice faltering slightly. "I've been walking ever since. I don't know where to go or what to do. I just need a place to rest just for tonight. I promise I won't be any trouble." Colton didn't know whether to believe her or not. The Wild West was a dangerous place, full of all sorts of people with hidden agendas. But she looked so lost, so alone, that part of him wanted to trust her. He had no reason to believe she was lying, and something inside him tugged at him to offer her help. He had never been one to turn away someone in need, especially when they were so vulnerable. After a long silence, Colton sighed, running a hand through his unkempt beard. "You can stay for the night," he said. "But I'm not sure what you're expecting." "This isn't a hotel." Sarah's eyes lit up with gratitude. "Thank you," she said quickly. "I won't be a burden. I promise." Colton stepped aside, allowing her to enter the cabin. She was quiet as she walked through the door, her boots heavy on the wooden floorboards. Colton noticed that she didn't look around at the rustic, worn-down cabin with its sparse furniture. She seemed focused only on finding a place to rest. "I'll get you some water," Colton said, moving toward the small kitchen area. The silence between them felt strange, like two people who didn't quite know how to interact anymore. As he filled a tin cup with water, Colton could feel her eyes on him, studying him. He glanced back at her, but she quickly looked away, almost as if she had been caught in the act of something she didn't want him to notice. When Colton handed her the cup of water, their fingers brushed briefly, and for a moment, he felt an odd jolt of electricity. It was a strange sensation, one he hadn't felt in years, and he quickly dismissed it as nothing more than the result of too much solitude. Still, he couldn't help but notice the way she looked at him, like she was studying him just as much as he was studying her. "I'm sorry to impose," Sarah said after a moment, her voice soft, "but I don't have anywhere else to go. And I don't know how much longer I can keep going." Colton nodded, feeling a sense of unease creep into his chest. There was something about this woman, something more than just the exhaustion in her eyes, that made him feel like he was stepping into a world he wasn't prepared for. But at the same time, he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. She was here now, and he had made the choice to help her. He couldn't undo it. "You're safe here," Colton said, though his words felt hollow. "For tonight." Sarah nodded in silence, grateful but guarded. As they sat in the dimly lit cabin, the weight of the silence between them felt heavy, like two strangers in a world that didn't have room for either of them. Little did Colton know, this was only the beginning. The night would bring more than just shelter, and Sarah's presence would stir something deep inside him, a longing he had long forgotten. As the night wore on, the two of them would find themselves tangled in something far more complicated than either of them could have imagined. The night had settled in around the cabin like a heavy blanket, and the fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The wind howled outside, making the old wood of the house groan with every gust. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Colton sat across from Sarah at the small wooden table, his gaze never leaving her. He hadn't expected to find himself in this position, not with a stranger, and certainly not with a woman like her. For a while, neither of them spoke. The only sounds were the occasional crack of the fire and the distant howling of the wind. Colton didn't know what to say. He had offered her a place to stay, and she had accepted without hesitation, but something about her made him uneasy. She was too calm, too composed, as if she wasn't as helpless as she seemed. Colton's instincts told him to be careful, but there was something in her eyes, something that made him wonder if she was hiding more than she was letting on. Sarah, for her part, had spent the last few minutes studying Colton. She was trying to figure him out, trying to understand why he had agreed to take her in. She had been on the run for days, constantly moving, always looking over her shoulder. She had learned to survive on her own, never trusting anyone for too long. Yet there was something different about Colton. His rough exterior and quiet demeanor suggested a man who didn't trust easily, yet he had given her shelter without question. She couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude mixed with curiosity. Who was this man, really? After a long silence, Sarah finally spoke. "I'm not used to being around people," she said quietly, her voice low but steady. "I've spent most of my life on my own. But out here, in the wild, it feels different." "I don't know how to explain it." Colton raised an eyebrow, surprised by the sudden openness in her voice. "You're not from around here," he said, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Where are you from?" Sarah hesitated, her fingers nervously twisting the edge of her sleeve. "I grew up in a small town," she began. "My family wasn't well off, but we made do. It wasn't much, but it was home until things changed. My uncle and I were on our way to another town when, well, we ran into some trouble." Colton listened intently, sensing that she was holding back. "What kind of trouble?" Sarah's eyes flickered with a mixture of fear and defiance. She didn't want to share too much. Her past was a wound she wasn't ready to open. But something about Colton's presence made her feel like she could, like he might understand. "I'm not a damsel in distress," she said, her voice growing firmer. "I'm not helpless. But there are people after me. Dangerous people." Colton leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "What do you mean?" "Who's after you?" "I don't want to talk about it," Sarah replied quickly, her voice cold as if to shut him out. "Not yet." Colton didn't push any further. He could see the walls Sarah had built around herself, and he respected them. He knew all too well how it felt to keep your secrets buried deep inside. But he couldn't ignore the tension in the room, the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Still, for the moment, he decided to let her have her space. The last thing he wanted was to make her feel cornered. As the evening wore on, Sarah seemed to relax slightly. though the air between them remained charged with unspoken words. She had settled into a chair by the fire, her eyes flickering between the flames and Colton as if trying to decide whether to trust him or not. Colton, too, had his own thoughts. There was something about her, something that both intrigued and unsettled him. She was so different from the women he had known back in the towns. She wasn't looking for romance or pity or protection. She seemed like someone who had learned to depend on herself, someone who didn't need anyone's help. And yet here she was in his cabin seeking refuge. The fire crackled again, and for a moment the sound filled the room. Colton felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply watched Sarah, his gaze lingering on her face. There was a softness in her features that contrasted sharply with the hardness in her eyes. Suddenly, Sarah spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "You probably think I'm lying," she said, not looking at him but staring into the flames. Colton was caught off guard by her words. "I never said that," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "No, you didn't have to," Sarah said, her voice carrying a hint of bitterness. "People always think I'm lying, that I'm making things up, that I'm just looking for attention." She paused, and when she spoke again, her words were more intense. "But I'm not. I'm not crazy. There are people who want me, Colton. People who will stop at nothing to get me." The use of his name caught him off guard, but he didn't say anything. He simply watched her, waiting for her to continue. "You're probably wondering why I ended up here in the middle of nowhere. The truth is, I didn't have a choice. I had to run. They were after me, and I couldn't stay where I was anymore. I thought I could make it on my own, but it's harder than I thought. The world is a dangerous place for someone like me." Colton's heart softened, though he didn't show it. He could hear the pain in her voice, the raw honesty that she had been hiding for so long. It wasn't easy for her to admit any of this, but there it was, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of protectiveness welling up inside him. "You're safe here for now," Colton said, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, though there was a hint of uncertainty behind the calm exterior. "You can stay as long as you need." Sarah looked at him, and for the first time since she had arrived, her eyes softened. There was something in her gaze, a mix of gratitude and something else, a flicker of vulnerability that she rarely let show. She nodded quietly, accepting his offer without saying a word. But Colton could sense that things were far from over. This woman, Sarah, was hiding something. She wasn't just running from dangerous men. There was more to her story than she was letting on. Colton didn't know what it was, but he could feel it in the air between them. As the night dragged on, neither of them spoke much more. Sarah sat quietly by the fire, lost in her thoughts while Colton went about his chores, keeping busy, trying to avoid thinking too much about the strange connection that seemed to be forming between them. But no matter how hard he tried to push it away, he couldn't ignore the fact that Sarah's presence had stirred something inside him, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. And as the night wore on, Colton couldn't help but wonder, what kind of trouble had Sarah gotten herself into, and was he ready to face whatever was coming their way? The days that followed Sarah's arrival were quiet, but not peaceful. The ranch, once a place of solitude for Colton, now felt strangely full. Sarah moved through the cabin, her presence a constant reminder of the uncertainty that had crept into his life. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the air was thick with the weight of unspoken words. Neither Colton nor Sarah had the courage to say what was truly on their minds, and so they carried on in silence, each lost in their own thoughts, while the outside world seemed to press in on them. Colton had grown used to living alone. The simple tasks of daily life, feeding the animals, mending the fences, tending to the crops, had once been enough to keep his mind occupied. But now, with Sarah there, every moment felt different. Her presence, though a welcome distraction, made him aware of the emptiness inside himself. She was a reminder of the world he had shut himself off from, a world full of connections, of people, of things he had once cared about, but had long since pushed away. Sarah, for her part, was struggling too. She wasn't used to relying on anyone, least of all a man like Colton. Her life had been about survival, about keeping her distance from people who might hurt her, about trusting only herself. But there was something about Colton that made her want to lower her guard. Something in the way he looked at her with quiet understanding, like he knew what it was like to be alone. to feel like the world had turned its back on you. Still, she couldn't bring herself to fully trust him. Not yet. As the days passed, their interactions grew more comfortable, though there was always an edge of tension between them. They worked together on the ranch, Colton showing Sarah how to care for the animals, how to repair the fences, how to survive in a place like this. She was quick to learn, her hands strong and capable even though she had no experience with the harsh life of a rancher. She took to the work with determination, her quiet strength beginning to impress Colton more and more. But there were moments when their eyes would meet across the cabin or across the fields, when something unspoken passed between them. It was a strange sensation, one Colton couldn't quite understand. He had lived for so long without anyone to share his thoughts with, that he wasn't sure how to react when someone like Sarah came into his life, so different from the people he had known before. One evening, as they were working side by side, Sarah looked up at him and spoke, breaking the quiet that had settled between them. "I don't know why you're being so kind to me," she said, her voice soft but her words laced with something that sounded almost like suspicion. "You don't owe me anything." Colton paused, his hands still on the fence post he had been fixing. For a moment he didn't know how to answer. He didn't owe her anything, that much was true. She was a stranger to him, a woman who had shown up out of nowhere asking for shelter, but there was something inside him, something that told him he couldn't turn her away.
"Even if he wanted to. I guess I just don't like to see people suffer," he said.
His voice rough, as if the words were foreign to him. "And you're not like the others I've known. You're different." Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by his honesty. She didn't expect him to open up, to share something like that. But there was something about him, his quiet, steady presence that made her feel like she could trust him, even if only a little. "I'm not like the others," she repeated, her eyes narrowing as she considered his words. "You're right about that. But it's not because I'm special. It's because I've had to survive on my own. I've had to do things I'm not proud of." Colton could sense the pain in her voice, the way she was holding something back, something too heavy to put into words. He didn't press her for details. He knew better than that. In the Wild West, people didn't share their secrets easily. Everyone had their own scars, their own pasts that they preferred to keep hidden. "Surviving isn't easy," Colton said, looking at her with understanding. "But it doesn't have to mean you're alone." For the first time since she had arrived, Sarah looked at him as if she were seeing him in a new light. There was something in his words that resonated with her. She had been alone for so long, running from one place to the next, never allowing herself to form any real connections. But now with Colton it felt different. He wasn't trying to save her or pity her. He was simply offering her something she had never asked for: companionship, understanding, and the possibility that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face the world alone. That night, after their work was done, Sarah sat by the fire, her mind restless as she tried to make sense of the emotions swirling inside her. She had never been one to show weakness, to let her guard down. But there was something about Colton, something about the way he seemed to see through her walls that made her want to open up to him. She wasn't ready yet, but she could feel the walls around her heart starting to crack little by little. Colton, too, was wrestling with his own thoughts. He had lived alone for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to have someone in his life, to have someone to share the silence with. Sarah's presence was both a comfort and a challenge. He didn't know what to make of the feelings stirring inside him, feelings he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't sure if it was pity, attraction, or something else entirely, but whatever it was making him question everything he had believed about himself, about the life he had chosen. The next day, as they worked together again, Sarah's demeanor seemed different. She was still quiet, but there was a certain softness to her that Colton hadn't seen before. She wasn't trying to hide from him, and for the first time, Colton found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to trust him. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the ranch, Sarah turned to Colton and said, "You're right, surviving alone is hard. But it's not just the work that's hard. It's the loneliness." Colton met her gaze, surprised by her words. He had never heard her speak like that before. He nodded, knowing exactly what she meant. The loneliness of living on a ranch far away from anyone else was something that gnawed at you, even when you didn't admit it. The silence of the land, the emptiness of the wide open spaces, it could drive a man mad if he wasn't careful. "We don't have to be alone," Colton said, his voice steady but soft. It was a simple statement, but it felt like a promise. And for the first time in a long time, it felt like a promise he might actually want to keep. Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes. For a brief moment, Colton thought she might say something that would change everything, but she didn't. Instead, she just nodded and turned back to her work, the silence between them now filled with the weight of a connection neither of them had yet fully acknowledged. The days at the ranch had become more intense. Colton could feel the change in the air. It wasn't just the steady rhythm of the work or the way the sun beat down harder now that the season was shifting. There was something else, something unspoken that hung between him and Sarah. Every moment they spent together seemed to deepen the bond between them, though neither of them had put words to it. Colton had always kept his distance from others, but Sarah was different. She wasn't like anyone he had met before. She didn't need him to save her, nor did she want his pity. Yet something about her made him feel like maybe he wasn't as alone as he had thought. For Sarah, things were changing too. She had grown used to the silence that often filled the cabin, but now she found herself listening for Colton's voice, anticipating his presence. She didn't know what to make of it, these feelings that were stirring inside her. She had been on her own for so long, always watching her back, never allowing anyone to get too close. But with Colton, it was different. There was a steady calmness in him that made her feel, if only for a moment, like she didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders. It was on a late afternoon, when the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, that the silence was broken by the sound of hooves. Colton had been repairing a fence when he first heard it. The rhythmic pounding of hooves against the dry ground, growing louder with each passing second. He stopped what he was doing and turned, his hand instinctively reaching for the rifle that hung against the wall of the cabin. Sarah, who had been sitting near the fire, stood up, her eyes wide with alarm. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice a little too tense. Her body was stiff, and Colton could see the fear in her eyes. She didn't need to say it, but he knew she was worried about the people she had been running from. Her past was still lurking behind her, and he could tell she was afraid that it had finally caught up to her. Colton didn't answer right away. He walked slowly toward the door, peering out to see who was approaching. A small group of riders, their figures now visible in the distance, were making their way toward the ranch. Colton's jaw tightened. These weren't friendly visitors. He recognized them immediately. Their horses were strong and fast, their faces hard and untrusting. They were men who had no business being out here. Sarah stepped closer to him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. "What should we do?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Colton didn't want to show fear, not in front of Sarah. But he knew the danger was real. The men on horseback were no strangers to trouble. They had come for something, and Colton had a sinking feeling that it wasn't just a friendly visit. He turned to Sarah, his voice low but firm. "Stay inside," he ordered, his eyes locking with hers. "I'll handle this," but Sarah shook her head quickly. "I'm not hiding," she said, her voice more forceful than he expected. "I'm not running anymore. I can't." Colton looked at her for a long moment. He didn't want to argue, but he also didn't want her to get hurt. The men coming to the ranch weren't just out for a chat. They were dangerous, and he knew it. "They're not here for good reason," Colton said, his voice heavy with warning. "Stay inside and don't make a sound." Before Sarah could protest further, Colton grabbed his rifle and moved toward the porch. He could feel the tension rising in his chest, the kind that only came when you knew a confrontation was unavoidable. As the riders drew closer, Colton took his place on the porch, his hand steady on the rifle. The group of men stopped just at the edge of the property, their leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a scar running down his cheek, looking down at Colton with an unreadable expression. The wind picked up, sending dust swirling around their feet, but neither man moved. It was a standoff, one that neither of them had wanted, but one that was coming nonetheless. "What do you want?" Colton asked, his voice low but commanding. The man with the scar stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Colton. "We're looking for someone," he said slowly, his voice rough like gravel. "A woman. She came through here a few days ago. We know she's hiding out." Colton didn't react. He knew exactly who they were talking about. Sarah, the woman who had come to his ranch, the woman who had captured his attention in a way he didn't quite understand. He wasn't about to give her up no matter who was looking for her. "I don't know anyone like that," Colton lied, his grip tightening on the rifle. His heart was pounding, but he kept his face neutral, refusing to show any weakness. The man with the scar studied him for a moment, as if weighing whether or not to believe him. Colton held his ground, his eyes never leaving the other man's. He wasn't going to back down. "Not for Sarah, not now." "We know she's here," the man said, his voice cold and hard. "You can either hand her over or we'll search the place ourselves." Colton's eyes flickered toward the cabin. He could see Sarah's silhouette in the window, her body stiff, her face pale. He knew she was terrified, but he also knew she wasn't going to let him fight this battle for her alone. "I told you," Colton said, his voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of danger. "I don't know anyone by that description, and if you're thinking of searching my ranch, you'll have to go through me." There was a moment of silence. The tension in the air felt thick enough to slice through with a knife. Then the man with the scar stepped back, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "We don't want trouble, friend," he said, "but we'll find her. We always do." Without another word, the riders turned their horses and began to ride off, their figures disappearing into the horizon as quickly as they had come. Colton stood there watching them until they were nothing but dust in the distance. He didn't move until he was sure they were gone. Only then did he relax, his body going stiff with the tension that had built up. He slowly turned and made his way back to the cabin. When he entered, Sarah was standing near the fire, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "What happened?" she asked, her voice shaky. "They're gone for now," Colton said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "But I don't know how long that'll last." Sarah nodded, but her face was pale. "I can't keep running forever," she said quietly. "You don't have to protect me. I can't keep hiding." Colton looked at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He had always been alone, had always handled things on his own. But now, with Sarah by his side, things had changed. He had been ready to keep her hidden, to protect her from the dangers of the world, but now he knew she wasn't asking for his protection. She wasn't looking for safety. She was looking for something more. "We'll figure it out," Colton said, his voice firm. "Together." Days turned into weeks, and still, the ranch felt like a sanctuary, a fragile piece in the midst of a world that seemed to be constantly shifting around them. Colton had settled into a routine with Sarah, one that had become familiar and comforting even if it wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments of tension, but they were growing fewer. Each day they worked side by side, their bond slowly building, woven through shared silence and small, meaningful gestures. And with each passing day, Colton found himself thinking less about the solitary life he had once known, and more about the future, about the life he was building with Sarah. Yet, despite this quiet peace, something still loomed in the distance. The men who had come to the ranch looking for Sarah had not returned, but their threat had not disappeared. Colton knew that sooner or later, the trouble would catch up to them. It was only a matter of time. He could feel the weight of it, a pressure that seemed to grow heavier every day. Sarah, for her part, had begun to change as well. Her earlier guardedness had softened, though only slightly. She was still a woman with a past, one that she wasn't ready to fully share, but Colton could see the way she was beginning to trust him, little by little. She no longer flinched when he got too close, no longer pulled away when he offered her help. She had begun to open up just a little. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for Colton, that something was enough to make him believe they could have a future, despite the danger that still followed them. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Colton sat on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The wind had picked up, swirling dust in the air, and the sky was painted with the vibrant colors of sunset. He was lost in thought when Sarah came out and sat beside him. The silence between them was comfortable now, the kind that comes from shared understanding. "You've been quiet," Sarah said, her voice breaking the stillness. She looked at him, her expression unreadable. Colton didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared out at the vast open land before him. The world around them felt both infinite and confining at the same time. The ranch was a place of safety, but it also felt like a cage. The walls of the cabin, the fences, the land, it all seemed to close in on him when he allowed himself to think too much about the future. "I'm thinking," he said finally, his voice low as if the words had taken time to form. "I'm thinking about what comes next." Sarah shifted beside him, her gaze falling to the ground. What do you mean? Colton let out a long breath, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the armrest of his chair. I can't keep you hidden forever, Sarah, and I can't keep running from whatever's out there. Sooner or later, we'll have to face it, whatever it is, whatever it was that you're running from. Sarah's body stiffened slightly, but she didn't pull away. Her eyes locked on the horizon, her expression hardening with a quiet determination. I know, she said quietly. I've been trying to forget, to pretend it doesn't matter. But I know I can't. The air between them felt heavier now, filled with unspoken truths. Sarah had never wanted to face her past, not really. She had kept running, moving from place to place, always looking over her shoulder. But here, with Colton, she had found something she hadn't expected, a sense of peace. For the first time in a long time, she had allowed herself to let go of the constant fear. She had allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, she could have something more than just survival. Colton turned to face her, his expression serious. I'm not going to let you face this alone. Whatever it is, we'll handle it together. Sarah's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time, Sarah didn't pull away. She didn't retreat into the walls she had built around herself. Instead, she let his words sink in, her mind racing with a mixture of fear and hope. They both knew the dangers weren't over. But there was something different now. The bond between them had grown stronger, a connection that neither of them could deny. And it was this connection, this quiet promise of support and understanding, that gave them both the strength to face what lay ahead. As the days passed, the reality of their situation became more clear. Colton began making preparations, securing the ranch further and making sure they had everything they needed in case things turned ugly. Sarah, though reluctant, began to help. She had lived her life by running and hiding, but now for the first time she was willing to fight for something. Fight for a life that didn't have to be spent looking over her shoulder. For a future she could have with Colton. One afternoon, as they were working together near the barn, Colton spoke again, his voice quiet but determined. I've been thinking about what we'll do next, about where we go from here. Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? I mean, Colton said, walking over to her, that I don't want to keep living like this, hiding out, hoping the past doesn't catch up to us. It's not the life I want, and I don't think it's the life you want either. You don't have to keep running. We can face whatever comes together. Sarah was silent for a moment, her eyes searching his face. She didn't know what to say. Part of her still wanted to run, to escape the things she couldn't change. But another part of her, one that had been growing since she had come to the ranch, wanted to stay. Wanted to trust. Wanted to fight. What are you saying? She asked, her voice a little shaky. Colton smiled softly, a hint of sadness in his eyes. I'm saying we have a choice. We don't have to keep running, Sarah. We can face whatever's coming together, and maybe we'll find a way to build something better, something real, something we can both be proud of. For a moment, there was only silence between them, the kind of silence that felt both heavy and hopeful at the same time. And then Sarah finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I want that too, she said, her eyes locking with his. But I don't know how to let go of all the fear. Colton reached out, gently placing his hand over hers. You don't have to do it alone, he said softly. You never have to be alone again. I'll be here. It was then that Sarah felt it, the shift, the change in her heart. She had been running from herself for so long, trying to escape her past. But now, with Colton by her side, she began to see a different path, one that didn't require her to hide or be afraid. Together, they could face whatever was coming, whatever danger or darkness still lingered in her past. And maybe, just maybe, they could build something that wasn't defined by fear but by love, trust, and the hope of a future together. As the sun set that evening, painting the sky with soft colors of red and gold, Colton and Sarah stood side by side, their hands resting together, ready to face whatever the world had in store for them, together.